Think you know what it was like to live in the past. The Middle Ages weren't filled with knights in shining armor or romantic castles. They were brutal, filthy, and dangerous in ways that would shock you today. Most people barely survived past 30, spent their days battling disease and starvation, and lived in conditions that would horrify us now. From the moment you woke up until you fell asleep, if you were lucky enough to survive the day, every breath was a gamble with death. We're going to explore what a single day in medieval Europe was really like, and trust me, you wouldn't last long. If you like these videos, I would appreciate if you clicked like or subscribed, as it's important for the channel and it helps others find it too, just like you did. Now, let's get started. Picture this. You've just slipped through time and landed square in the year 1325. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smell. That thick, heavy air that seems to carry the weight of 1,000 unwashed bodies, mixed with something that might be rotting vegetables, or maybe it's just Tuesday. Your new home is a wooden hut. And when I say home, I mean one room that serves as bedroom, kitchen, living room, and barn, all rolled into one. The walls are thin, the roof leaks when it rains, and privacy is about as foreign a concept as electricity. You share this cozy space with your entire family, a few chickens, maybe a goat, and definitely more insects than you could count in a lifetime. The bed you wake up on is a masterpiece of medieval engineering, which is to say it's a pile of straw that used to live on a barn floor. The bugs living in it have probably established their own little civilization by now. Your blanket is made of wool that hasn't seen soap since the last harvest season, and it weighs about as much as a small person from all the accumulated grime and moisture. Morning arrives with the sound of church bells, clanging across the countryside like some sort of ancient alarm system that nobody asked for but everyone has to live with. There's no snooze button in the 14th century, just the relentless march of time marked by those bronze bells echoing off stone walls. Getting out of bed is its own adventure. Your 22-year-old body feels like it belongs to someone twice your age. Your joints creak and pop like old wooden furniture, and your spine sounds like a door that desperately needs oil. Age hits different when you're living on thin soup and hard bread, when every winter is a battle against cold and hunger. The floor beneath your feet tells its own story. Maybe it's wet from last night's rain that found its way through the thatched roof, or maybe it's crusty from whatever the animals decided to leave behind. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the experience, part of the endless cycle of dirt and survival that defines daily life. Privacy, that precious thing we take for granted, simply doesn't exist. Your family sleeps beside you, maybe a cousin or two who just never left after the last harvest festival. Everyone's breathing mingles in the cold air. Everyone's snores blend into one communal symphony of sleep. When nature calls in the medieval world, it's not a polite suggestion, it's a demanding shout. The bathroom is a wooden bucket tucked behind the house, usually overflowing because someone else had a rough night after eating questionable turnips. The smell hits you like a physical wall, something you feel in your chest as much as your nose. In towns, the streets serve as open sewers. People dump their waste right out their windows, sometimes remembering to shout a warning in Old French, something that roughly translates to "watch out below." Though honestly, people rarely move fast enough to avoid the unpleasant surprise raining down from above. The lucky folks in bigger towns might have access to public latrines, which sounds fancy until you realize it's just a communal outhouse, where privacy is a joke, and ventilation is whatever breeze happens to wander through. You sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers, making small talk while trying not to breathe too deeply. Toilet paper is still centuries away from being invented, so people make do with whatever they can find. Straw, leaves, scraps of cloth, moss, if they're feeling fancy. Sometimes nothing at all. This might explain why handshakes weren't exactly the greeting of choice back then. Even in castles, where you'd expect things to be better, the bathroom situation has its own unique challenges. The garderobe, a hole in the castle wall that drops waste directly into the moat below, seems like brilliant engineering until you consider that enemies know about this design flaw. Yes, attackers sometimes use these waste chutes as an unconventional entrance, climbing up through what might be the most unpleasant back door in history. Whether you're a peasant farmer or a wealthy baron, the daily ritual of relieving yourself is cold, often public, frequently dangerous, and always unpleasant. One wrong step on a wet stone path, and you're tumbling face first into humanity's collective leftovers. The medieval world operates on a different set of rules, where survival trumps comfort every single time. Every morning is a small victory against cold, hunger, disease, and the general hostility of a world that doesn't seem particularly interested in keeping you alive. The simple act of waking up, getting out of bed, and facing another day requires a kind of resilience that's hard to imagine from our modern perspective. Picture yourself stirring awake in medieval Europe, your stomach already growling with hunger. The morning meal awaits you, but it won't be what you're hoping for. There's no cheerful kitchen humming with activity, no pleasant aromas wafting through the air. Instead, you'll find yourself crouched by a smoky fire, staring down at a wooden bowl filled with something called pottage. This thick, murky stew has been bubbling away in the same pot for days, maybe even weeks. New ingredients get tossed in whenever someone finds them: grains, root vegetables, the occasional bean if fortune smiles upon you. It's less cooking, more like a continuous experiment in survival. The mixture looks about as appetizing as something you'd scrape off your boot after a long walk through the countryside, but this gloopy concoction is what keeps you alive, so you'll eat it without complaint. Beside your bowl sits a chunk of bread that could probably serve as a weapon if needed. Made from coarse rye or barley, it's been stretched with whatever the baker could find: sawdust, ground acorns, bits of this and that. Wheat bread exists only in the fantasies of peasants and the kitchens of the wealthy. This loaf doesn't yield to gentle pressure. You don't slice it so much as negotiate with it, chipping away pieces like a stonemason working granite. Your jaw will get quite the workout before you manage to swallow even a few bites. What to wash it all down with? Forget about clear, refreshing water. That's a luxury you can't afford, not when every stream and well harbors invisible dangers. Instead, you'll sip weak ale, starting your day with alcohol, because it's safer than the alternative. Even children drink this diluted beer, not because anyone particularly enjoys it, but because staying alive trumps personal preference. The water teems with things that could make you very sick, very quickly, so beer becomes your daily companion from dawn till dusk. Meat remains a distant dream for most people. Perhaps on special feast days, if your lord feels generous, you might taste a morsel. But for the average person, meat appears on the table only a handful of times each year. Fresh fruit exists only when nature provides it, and even then, much of it gets fermented into wine before it reaches your bowl. Spices belong to another world entirely. A pinch of pepper costs more than most people earn in a month. Salt gets locked away like precious treasure, guarded carefully and used sparingly. Your meals exist in a realm of bland necessity, where flavor takes a distant second place to simply having something to eat. So you chew your gritty bread, swallow your morning ale, and try not to think about whatever creatures might have sampled your pottage during the night. Rats consider your food as much theirs as yours, and there's little you can do to argue the point. This morning ritual doesn't energize you for the day ahead. It simply happens to you, a necessary pause before the real work begins. And work you must, because your survival depends entirely on what you can accomplish with your hands and your back. Now comes the matter of getting dressed, though that's perhaps too generous a term for what you'll be doing. Your entire wardrobe consists of exactly one outfit, a rough wool tunic or linen shift that's been your constant companion for months, possibly years. There's no changing with the seasons, no variety to brighten your days. You have these clothes, and you'll wear them until they literally fall apart, or until the various fungi and bacteria living in them finally claim victory. The concept of underwear remains optional at best, a luxury that many simply do without. If fortune has blessed you, perhaps you own a linen undertunic to provide a thin barrier between your skin and the scratchy wool outer layer. If not, well, you'll spend your days in direct contact with fabric, that feels like it was woven from tree bark and good intentions. These garments carry the accumulated scent of daily life, a complex bouquet that includes sweat, smoke, animals, and things better left unidentified. Washing clothes presents its own set of challenges, requiring hauled water, precious fuel for heating, and time that's desperately needed for other survival tasks. When you do attempt to clean your clothing, you'll scrub it against rough boards using ashes or lye, harsh substances that clean through sheer chemical aggression. Then you hang everything to dry in whatever sunlight you can find, which in medieval Europe seems to appear about as often as honest tax collectors. Your feet face their own particular hardships. Shoes, if you're lucky enough to own any, consist of barely treated leather, held together with hope and rough stitching. They provide about as much support and protection as wrapping your feet in thick leaves. Most people simply go barefoot, stepping through mud, animal waste, sharp stones, and puddles of questionable origin. Your feet become tough through necessity, developing calluses that serve as natural armor against the hostile ground. All of this creates a situation where your skin becomes a battleground. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs set up permanent residence on your body, treating you like a combination hotel and restaurant. Everyone shares this burden, from lowly peasants to wealthy nobles, from devoted monks to innocent children. You'll find yourself scratching constantly, using whatever tools come to hand: wooden spoons, rough stones, the corners of furniture. No one considers this unusual behavior because everyone lives with the same discomfort. Conversations happen while people absent-mindedly scratch various itchy spots, and nobody thinks twice about it. Your scalp becomes a landscape of bites and irritation. Raw patches develop where fabric rubs against skin, day after day. Rashes bloom and spread without anyone to explain what causes them or how to make them stop. These skin conditions become long-term companions, sometimes lasting for months without relief. There's no medical professional to consult about these problems, no soothing creams or healing ointments to provide comfort. You simply endure whatever your skin decides to do, accepting itching and irritation as normal parts of daily existence. This is how you prepare yourself for another day in medieval Europe, wrapped in discomfort, accompanied by various tiny creatures, and ready to face whatever challenges await outside your humble dwelling. Back in medieval times, people would wake up each morning and pull on layers of wool that never seemed to quite dry out. The fabric scratched against their skin, and dampness clung to every thread. But here's the fascinating thing: they couldn't just flash a cheerful grin to start their day. Smiling was actually risky business back then, not because of social customs, but because of what lurked inside their mouths. Imagine a world where toothbrushes simply didn't exist. No minty paste to scrub away the day's damage. No refreshing rinse to clear the air. The whole concept of cleaning your teeth was about as foreign as the idea of taking daily baths, which most people avoided entirely. Some folks might gnaw on a stick or swish some wine around their mouth, but that was about as sophisticated as dental care got. By the time someone reached their 20s, their smile told a story of neglect and decay. Cavities had taken up permanent residence, gums swelled with infection, and teeth bore stains that went far deeper than any food could cause. The wealthy had their own special problems with oral health. Sugar was starting to make its way into their diets, imported at enormous expense from distant lands. Rich nobles would show off by serving tiny sugar cakes at their feasts, unknowingly accelerating the destruction of their teeth far faster than any peasant could manage. For the poor, dental decay was a slower burn. Years of chewing tough bread, scraping through gritty porridge, and grinding down whatever food they could find gradually wore their teeth to nubs. Toothaches became a constant companion, like having a storm cloud that never quite moved on. The pain was the kind that made people contemplate desperate measures, and desperate they often became. When a tooth needed to come out, there was no gentle dentist with modern tools waiting to help. Instead, the local barber surgeon would step in. Picture this: the same person who trimmed your hair would also yank out your rotting molars by candlelight, using nothing more than an iron hook and perhaps a strong drink to dull the edge. No numbing medicine existed, just gritted teeth and prayers that you'd survive the procedure. An infected tooth wasn't just painful, it could become a death sentence. Without any way to fight bacterial infections, a simple toothache could spiral into fever, blood poisoning, and death. People died from dental problems that today would send us to the pharmacy for a quick antibiotic prescription. Social interactions carried their own challenges when everyone's breath told the story of their dental struggles. Romance wasn't judged by winning smiles or fresh breath. Instead, potential partners were evaluated based on how much land they owned and how many animals grazed in their fields. Love had to bloom, despite the harsh realities of medieval hygiene. After dealing with throbbing teeth and scratchy clothes, people would step outside to begin their real work. For about 9 out of every 10 people, this meant a life of back-breaking labor with no end in sight. There were no office buildings, no coffee breaks, no hope of climbing a corporate ladder. Instead, there was just the endless cycle of working someone else's land, from sunrise until the sun disappeared behind the tree line. Most people were peasants, bound to work fields that belonged to lords who might not even know their names. Their tools were simple: a wooden hoe, a rusty blade for cutting grain, and whatever strength remained in their aging bodies. The concept of weekends didn't exist. Sunday might offer a brief respite, but only if crops didn't need harvesting or raiders weren't threatening the village. The physical demands were crushing. Fields had to be plowed by hand or with oxen. If anyone was fortunate enough to own such valuable animals, people spent their days digging trenches, scattering seeds, pulling endless weeds, and hauling heavy buckets of water until their spines curved under the constant strain. Nobody asked about job satisfaction or work-life balance. Survival was the only performance metric that mattered. Women carried double burdens, working the fields alongside men while also raising children, maintaining households, cooking meals, spinning wool into cloth, tending animals, and managing the uncomfortable reality that personal hygiene problems were constantly shared between family members. Children entered the workforce around age 5, trading any chance of education or play for tiny tools and the slim hope of avoiding the diseases that claimed so many young lives. Those lucky enough to work as craftsmen, perhaps as blacksmiths, leather workers or barrel makers, faced their own unique challenges. They spent their days with dangerous fires, toxic chemicals, or decomposing animal parts, all in poorly ventilated workshops that trapped harmful fumes. The compensation barely covered basic survival needs, and workplace injuries were simply accepted as part of life. Breaking a bone or developing a fever meant drinking warm beer and continuing to work, because stopping wasn't really an option. If someone couldn't work, they couldn't eat. And if they couldn't eat, medieval society had a simple solution. Someone else would take their place. People gripped their shovels despite bleeding blisters and kept digging, because work wasn't about building a career or finding fulfillment. It was an endless test of human endurance, played out one painful day at a time. Picture yourself in a world where the sky itself seems angry with you. Medieval life meant living at the complete mercy of whatever weather decided to throw your way. Summer wasn't a relief, it was just a different kind of torture. Your wooden house, with its gaps wide enough for small animals to slip through, would transform into something resembling a bread oven. The heat would press down on you, relentless and suffocating. Without any way to cool down, you'd sweat through every layer of clothing you owned. But removing those layers wasn't really an option. Showing skin meant social scandal, painful sunburn, and becoming a feast for every biting insect in the village. The flies would circle you like tiny vultures, drawn to your unwashed body and the lingering smell of old food rotting in the corner of your home. At night, mosquitoes would sing their annoying songs right into your ear. Sleep became a luxury, especially with neighbors shouting and babies crying through the thin walls. If you worked in the fields, the sun would beat down on your head mercilessly. No sunscreen existed, no proper hat unless you managed to weave something from straw, making you look like a walking scarecrow. When people collapsed from the heat, nobody called it heat stroke. It was just taking a bad turn, another mysterious misfortune that life handed out randomly. The concept of medical understanding was still centuries away from making sense of these things. Winter brought its own special brand of misery. Those same wooden walls with their generous gaps now invited every cold wind to come inside and make itself comfortable. Your windows weren't made of glass, just cloth hanging there, doing very little to keep anything out. The fireplace might sound cozy, but firewood cost money most people didn't have. Even worse, gathering wood from the forest could literally get you killed. Yes, picking up the wrong stick from the wrong patch of land was sometimes a capital offense. Property laws were taken very seriously, even when it came to fallen branches. So you'd huddle near dying embers in your single damp wool tunic, watching your breath form clouds in your own home. Your feet would stay perpetually cold and wet. Your fingers would become so stiff they felt like little frozen sticks. What we'd recognize as frostbite was simply called bad luck back then. People would wake up with frozen noses, wondering if their toes would survive until spring arrived. The cruel irony was that no matter which season you endured, your clothes would still itch against your skin, your food would still taste terrible, and there would always be more work waiting for you. Climate control was a concept that wouldn't exist for centuries. Now imagine feeling thirsty in this world. Water, that basic necessity we take for granted, was essentially trying to murder everyone quietly. That clear, bubbling stream near your village might look like something from a fairy tale, but it was actually a death trap waiting to happen. Upstream from where you might drink, someone had just emptied their chamber pot. Or maybe a dead animal was slowly decomposing, sharing its decay with anyone downstream. Every sip contained an invisible army of parasites, bacteria, and microscopic enemies ready to wage war inside your stomach. This is why medieval people drank beer instead. Even children drank beer regularly. Before you imagine medieval kids getting drunk at breakfast, understand that this was small beer weak in alcohol, but strong in survival value. The brewing process involved boiling water, which killed most of the dangerous microorganisms lurking in regular water sources. Wine was another option, but only if you had enough money and didn't mind being slightly intoxicated before noon became a regular lifestyle choice. The wealthy could afford this luxury, though functioning properly during daylight hours became somewhat optional. Bathing presents another fascinating contradiction. You might think people would use water for cleaning, and in theory they did. In practice, however, medieval medical wisdom taught that bathing actually made you sick. The belief was that washing opened your pores, creating convenient doorways for diseases to enter your body. People genuinely believed that never removing the protective layer of dirt and grime coating their skin actually kept them healthier. This layer of filth was seen as natural armor against illness. The irony is almost beautiful in its complete wrongness. Communal bathhouses did exist in some places, but they quickly developed reputations as centers for gossip, scandal, and various romantic activities that polite society frowned upon. Naturally, the church stepped in and shut most of them down, deciding that cleanliness was apparently less important than moral purity. Even if you wanted to take a bath, it required enormous effort. First, you'd trudge to the well to fetch water. Then you'd spend time and precious fuel boiling it over your fire. Next, you'd fill a wooden tub that probably leaked. Finally, you'd pray that nobody else in your household had used the water before you, or planned to use it after you were finished. Rainwater collection seemed like a reasonable alternative, but those open barrels became breeding grounds for insects, depositories for bird droppings, and tiny ecosystems where moss and algae thrived. The water you collected was often more dangerous than the stream water you were trying to avoid. Whether water was going into your mouth, onto your body, or into your crops, it represented a constant gamble with your life. One wrong sip could send you to a straw bed, clutching your stomach and reviewing every decision that led to that moment. Your final days might be spent sweating and suffering, wondering why something so essential to life had become so dangerous. The next time you turn on a tap and drink clean water, without thinking, spare a moment for those medieval ancestors. They lived in a world where basic hydration meant rolling dice with death, where staying dirty was considered healthy, and where the weather wasn't just uncomfortable, it was an ongoing battle for survival. Back in medieval times, imagine feeling sick and needing help from a doctor. The trouble is, medicine back then was really just a fancy form of torture, wrapped up in religious explanations and dubious science. When you got sick, no matter what was wrong with you, whether it was a simple cough or something more serious like the plague, doctors had one explanation. Your body's 4 humours were out of balance. These humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were supposed to work together like ingredients in a soup. Keep them balanced, stay healthy. Let them get out of whack, and you'd find yourself in real trouble. Running a fever meant you had too much blood coursing through your veins. The solution seemed obvious to medieval doctors. They'd drain some of it out. They called this bloodletting, and it was as pleasant as it sounds. Sometimes they'd use a dull blade to make cuts. Other times they'd bring out the leeches. These hungry little creatures would latch onto your skin and suck away what doctors thought was your excess blood. Here's something interesting: your local barber often doubled as your medical professional. You could walk in for a haircut and walk out having lost a pint of blood. 2 services for the price of 1, though neither was particularly good. Feeling sad or anxious got you a different treatment entirely. Doctors blamed this on too much black bile, and their cure involved forcing everything out of your digestive system. They'd give you powerful laxatives, herbal mixtures that would purge your stomach, or sometimes they'd just suggest prayer and cold compresses, while everyone around you started acting like you might not make it. Breaking a bone or getting a serious wound put you in the worst position of all. There was no anesthesia, except for the possibility of passing out from the pain itself. Doctors performed surgery with knives that hadn't been properly cleaned, well, possibly ever. They'd heat their tools over fire, not because they understood sterilization, but because hot metal seemed more impressive and intimidating. The concept of germs wouldn't be discovered for centuries. Instead, people believed diseases came from bad air or from God being upset with your behavior. Got a stomachache? Must have been those sinful thoughts you'd been having. Hope you enjoyed confessing your sins while throwing up. When your condition got worse, doctors would double down on their treatments. More leeches, maybe some crushed beetles mixed into mysterious potions, and a priest standing by your bedside just in case the worst happened. At this point, death was considered just another form of medical treatment. If you somehow managed to recover, everyone assumed God had taken pity on your suffering soul. The doctor would take full credit for your miraculous healing, and that leech that had been sucking your blood probably got used on the next patient. Medieval medicine was less about actually healing people and more about surviving whatever cure the doctor prescribed. After spending your day dealing with medical treatments, hard labor, and various parasites living in your hair, you'd finally head home for what should have been the day's one pleasant moment, a warm meal. Unfortunately, your food was probably just as dangerous as everything else in your life. Food preservation barely existed back then. No refrigerators, no freezers, just salt, smoke, and hoping the cold winter air would keep things from rotting too quickly. If you were lucky enough to have meat, it had likely been hanging around for days, covered in flies, soaking in questionable liquids, and sharing space with rats and other creatures. Bread formed the foundation of most medieval meals, but even something as basic as bread came with risks. During bad harvest years, when grain was scarce, people would bulk up their bread with whatever they could find. Tree bark, sawdust, even clay got mixed into the dough to make it stretch further. Rye bread brought its own special dangers. Sometimes the grain got infected with a fungus that caused convulsions, hallucinations, and in worst cases, death. Eating this contaminated bread was like consuming a combination of hallucinogenic drugs and poison, all baked into what should have been your daily sustenance. Vegetables only appeared when they were in season, which meant lots and lots of turnips. Turnips boiled, turnips mashed, turnips floating in that mysterious stew called pottage that had been simmering over the fire since before you were born, picking up flavors and questionable ingredients along the way. Fresh fruit might show up in the fall, but it rotted quickly, without proper storage. Sugar was incredibly rare and expensive, hoarded by wealthy people who could afford it. Ironically, the rich folks who could buy sugar often had black, rotted teeth to show for it. Dairy products presented another gamble every time you ate them. Fresh milk would spoil within hours. Butter and cheese lasted longer, but they were loaded with bacteria that could make you seriously ill. People ate them anyway, because the alternative was often chewing on leather boots for sustenance. When it came to adding flavor to food, most people were out of luck. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg were worth more than gold. The average person had to make do with onions, a bit of salt if they were fortunate, and mostly just the natural taste of whatever they were eating, which often wasn't pleasant. Most meals ended up tasting like wet cloth sprinkled with disappointment and sadness. Food wasn't just a health risk, it was also a legal one. All the game animals, the deer, rabbits, and birds, belonged to the local lord, not to the people who lived on the land. Getting caught, hunting, or trapping one of these animals could result in hefty fines, time in prison, or even execution. Your dinner could literally get you killed, just for trying to catch it. So when you finally sat down to eat your grey, flavorless stew by the light of a flickering candle, every single bite represented a risk you were taking. But you ate it, anyway, because in medieval times, food wasn't really about nourishing your body. It was about testing your survival skills, one meal at a time. The bells begin ringing before dawn breaks, and they'll ring again at midday, then once more as darkness falls. These aren't gentle reminders, mind you. They're commands that echo through every cobbled street and buddy lane. Miss the call to prayer, and you've committed your first sin of the day. The church doesn't just influence medieval life, it orchestrates every single moment of it. Picture yourself waking up in that world, where your spiritual landlord never sleeps, and the rent is always overdue. Every breath you take, every step you make, falls under divine scrutiny. Your neighbor Agnes watches from her window, ready to report any suspicious behavior. The priest keeps mental notes during confession. Even your dreams aren't private, because thinking impure thoughts counts as sin number 2 before breakfast. The calendar itself belongs to the church. Dozens of holy days punctuate the year, but don't mistake them for vacations. These breaks from back-breaking labor come with their own demands. Mass attendance, ritual fasting, confession of every wrong thought you've harbored. Joy itself becomes a dangerous indulgence, something to be rationed carefully, like salt or candles. Latin words flow from the pulpit, mysterious and untouchable. The Bible remains locked away in this ancient language, reserved for those who wear robes instead of rags. You depend entirely on the priest's interpretation, his wisdom, his mood on any given Sunday. If he declares that your crop failed because your prayers lacked sincerity, well, time to kneel longer and harder next Sunday. The concept of tithing cuts deep into already empty pockets. 1/10 of everything, no exceptions. Your wheat, your eggs, your last copper coin. Poverty doesn't excuse you from this obligation, it simply makes the burden heavier. Spiritual bankruptcy runs parallel to financial ruin, and both seem equally inevitable. Hell burns bright in medieval imagination, painted in vivid detail during every sermon. Rivers of molten fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons wielding their famous pitchforks. The screams of the damned echo through priestly descriptions, making the plague seem almost merciful by comparison. This isn't abstract theology, it's your potential future, described with enthusiastic precision. Heretics face earthly flames before they meet hellish ones, Witches find themselves tested by drowning, a trial they cannot win. Blasphemers feel the sting of the lash. Skeptics learn quickly to keep their doubts private or watch them transform into something more acceptable. Questioning becomes a luxury few can afford. So you bow when expected, chant when required, pray with desperate hope that paradise awaits after this dirt-covered existence ends. Your salvation depends not just on divine mercy, but on maintaining the priest's good opinion. God might forgive, but the church keeps longer memories and more detailed records. Now imagine navigating this harsh world while carrying the additional burden of being born female. If medieval life runs on hard mode for everyone, women play without health potions, extra lives, or reasonable difficulty settings. From the moment of birth, your path stretches ahead with depressing predictability. Marriage arrives early, sometimes shockingly so. Betrothal at 12, pregnancy at 14. These markers pass without anyone consulting your preferences. Love plays no role in these arrangements, which focus instead on land deals, livestock trades, and family alliances. Your opinion carries the same weight as your dowry, which is to say, it matters only when it benefits someone else. Once married, you transform into property, valuable but owned. Your primary job involves producing heirs, preferably male ones, while simultaneously feeding everyone, maintaining the household, and contributing to fieldwork. Complaints earn you labels like nag, or worse, witch. Both carry consequences ranging from social ostracism to public execution. Childbirth operates like a deadly lottery, where everyone must play, but few win completely. No prenatal care exists, no sterile instruments, no pain relief beyond prayer and whatever herbs the midwife remembers. Minor complications become major crises. Some women survive 10 pregnancies and live to old age. Many others don't survive their second attempt. The baby's arrival multiplies your responsibilities rather than reducing them. Now you nurse a screaming infant in a lice-infested hut, while continuing to cook, clean, tend animals, and help with harvests. You become everyone else's break while never receiving one yourself. Single women attract suspicion, widows face vulnerability, outspoken women court danger. Accusations of witchcraft target females who possess herbal knowledge, strong personalities, or simply the misfortune of looking at someone on a particularly gloomy Tuesday. The line between helpful neighbor and dangerous sorceress shifts depending on local politics and personal grudges. Even within the church's protective walls, women face limitations. Nuns live under strict rules governing speech, movement, and spiritual authority. Their religious devotion ranks automatically below that of their male counterparts, regardless of personal piety or dedication. In this world of universal suffering, women somehow bear the additional expectation of suffering gracefully. Endurance, obedience, reproduction, and silence. Ideally accompanied by a patient smile, the medieval world demands strength while denying acknowledgement, requires contribution while limiting participation, expects perfection while providing few tools for success. Picture this: life in medieval times was like walking through a minefield every single day, where violence wasn't the exception, it was simply Tuesday. The whole concept of law and order was basically hoping your local lord had eaten a decent breakfast and wasn't feeling particularly cranky. Violence lived everywhere, tucked into every corner of daily existence. It waited in homes, lurked in narrow streets, dominated battlefields, even crept into church disputes. Sometimes it would bubble up while people stood in line at the communal bread oven, because apparently even waiting for your daily loaf could spark a fight. Crime wasn't unusual, it was expected, but here's where things get interesting. Punishment was pure theater. Steal a piece of bread, and you might wave goodbye to your hand forever. Get accused of lying, and someone might decide your tongue needed a little piercing, medieval style. Gossip a bit too much around town, and you'd meet something called the scold's bridle, which was basically a metal mask strapped to your head with a bar shoved in your mouth, all in the name of correction, naturally. Now, if you found yourself accused of something serious, like heresy, theft, or witchcraft. Proving your innocence became quite the adventure. They had this delightful system called trial by ordeal, and it worked exactly as terrifyingly as it sounds. One popular version involved sticking your hand into boiling water to fish out a stone. If your hand healed without infection in 3 days, congratulations, you were innocent. If it didn't heal properly, well, guilty as charged. Another charming option involved getting tossed into a river. If you sank like a stone, you were declared innocent, though you'd probably be quite dead by then. If you floated, you were guilty and faced punishment anyway. It was like participating in the world's worst game show, where survival was the only prize and the host was actively hoping you'd lose. Death sentences became public entertainment, performed in front of cheering crowds who treated executions like we might treat a movie premiere. Hangings, beheadings, burnings. Sometimes people would pack snacks and make it a family outing. It was medieval television, basically, just with a lot more blood and significantly worse production values. Domestic violence was woven into the fabric of normal life. Husbands weren't just allowed to discipline their wives and children, they were expected to. Society looked at you funny if you didn't occasionally rough up your family members. Street fights happened as regularly as sunrise, and you could find yourself beaten senseless just for glancing the wrong way at some noble's horse. War always simmered somewhere in the background, like a pot that never quite stopped boiling. Local feuds, territorial disputes, religious crusades. Someone was always marching off to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or simple boredom. Violence wasn't a sign that society was breaking down. Violence was society was the glue that held everything together in the strangest possible way. Everyone lived with this constant awareness that life hung by the thinnest thread imaginable. Justice was arbitrary, like rolling dice that were weighted against you, and your neighbor might bash your skull in over a disagreement about a pig. Walking carefully, keeping your eyes down, and never trusting anyone carrying a club weren't just good advice, they were survival strategies. But even if you somehow navigated through all the violence, all the disease, all the daily misery, you still faced the final chapter that awaited most medieval lives, an early and decidedly unglamorous death. If you managed to keep breathing past age 40, you were practically a walking miracle. People might actually call you the Old One, which wasn't really a nickname so much as recognition of a statistical impossibility. Life expectancy hovered somewhere around 30 to 40 years. Though those numbers tell a particularly grim story, nearly half of all children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Disease, malnutrition, one brutal winter, any of these could snuff out a young life without warning. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no real hope of medical intervention. If you survived childhood, you entered adulthood already worn down like an old tool. Work began the moment you could stand upright, and by 25 your joints would creak like old monastery doors. You'd probably be missing several teeth, maybe a finger, and definitely most of your original optimism about life. Women faced their own particular deadly obstacle course. Mainly childbirth, it ranked as one of the leading causes of death for medieval women. No pain relief, no medical help, just prayer, some hot water, and maybe someone to hold your hand while you bled out on a straw-stuffed cot. Men encountered different dangers, but they were equally relentless. Farming accidents could crush you. Infections from tiny wounds could kill you. Slowly, a neighbor's drunken rage could end you quickly. A crusade could go sideways and leave you dead in a foreign field. Even walking to market carried risks if you crossed paths with a bored bandit or an especially enthusiastic tax collector. Death could arrive quietly too, creeping in like fog. The plague would turn entire cities into cemeteries practically overnight. Famine could stretch across whole seasons, slowly thinning out villages person by person. Sometimes death came from simple bad luck, like eating spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating, screaming at walls that weren't really moving. Even funerals were a luxury many couldn't afford. Bodies got buried quickly to prevent disease from spreading. No embalming, no polished coffins, just a hole in the ground, a few mumbled prayers, and a shallow mound of earth, assuming there was still space left in the churchyard. In medieval times, life was brutal, short, and constantly under siege by death, in all its casual, creative forms. People didn't retire from their work, they just stopped showing up one day, and that was how most stories ended, not with celebration or ceremony, but with simple absence, a space where someone used to be. Picture waking up one morning and finding yourself in a world where brushing your teeth meant, well, hoping for the best. Where your bathroom was a bucket in the corner, and your breakfast might be nothing at all. This was just another Tuesday in medieval Europe, a place that sounds romantic in stories, but was actually a daily test of human endurance. The castles we imagine as grand and glittering were really more like stone iceboxes, drafty and cold, crawling with fleas. Even the wealthy nobles, wrapped in their fur cloaks and sipping wine from golden goblets, faced a coin-flip chance of dying from something as simple as an infected cut. Their marriages weren't about love. They were political contracts, signed and sealed like business deals. Imagine being born into a world where your entire life was decided by the family you happened to arrive in. Poor families stayed poor, rich families stayed rich, and moving between them was about as likely as flying to the moon. The phrase, climbing the social ladder, didn't exist because there was no ladder to climb. Every single task took forever. Making bread was an all-day affair. Healing from illness meant praying and hoping, because medicine was mostly guesswork, mixed with superstition. Having a baby was so dangerous that many women wrote their wills beforehand. Even something as basic as chewing your food could lead to serious problems if a tooth went bad. Life happened within a tiny circle, maybe 10 miles across if you were lucky. Most people were born, lived, worked, and died without ever seeing what lay beyond the next hill. There was no way to look things up, no way to learn about distant places, no way to even know what that strange rash might mean. But here's the remarkable thing about humans. Even in these harsh conditions, they still found ways to create joy. They told stories by firelight, sang songs while working in the fields, fell deeply in love, and passed down wisdom to their children. They carved beautiful designs into wooden bowls, embroidered intricate patterns on simple cloth, and gathered together to celebrate harvest festivals and weddings. The darkness of those times somehow made the small lights shine brighter. A shared meal, a funny joke, a baby's first steps. All of these moments carried extra weight because they were stolen from a world that offered so little comfort. Meanwhile, in a completely different corner of history, a young girl named Sophie was learning lessons that would reshape an empire. Born in 1729 in a small German duchy, she grew up in a household where warmth was scarce and ambition was everything. Her mother was the kind of person who saw people as stepping stones, cold and calculating in her pursuit of status. Sophie's father was a Prussian military man, distant and disciplined, more concerned with duty than with tucking his daughter into bed. But this harsh upbringing taught Sophie something valuable: how to watch and wait, how to read a room before opening her mouth, how to smile diplomatically while planning her next move. She devoured books like a hungry person devours bread, soaking up languages and ideas and stories from across Europe. Soaking up. While other noble children played with dolls, Sophie was studying the art of conversation, learning how to make people feel important while gathering information about their weaknesses and desires. When the Russian Empress Elizabeth began looking for a wife for her heir, Peter, she wanted someone foreign, someone who would be grateful for the opportunity and easy to control. Sophie, barely 14 years old, seemed perfect for this role. Young, noble enough to be respectable, but not powerful enough to be threatening. The journey from Germany to Russia was like traveling to another planet. Sophie arrived in St. Petersburg, wearing clothes too thin for the brutal Russian winter, accompanied by her scheming mother and carrying nothing but her wits and her ambition. The city was a frozen maze of palaces and poverty, where French was spoken in the drawing rooms and Russian was whispered in the servants' quarters. To become acceptable to Russian society, Sophie had to abandon everything familiar. She converted from her Lutheran faith to Russian Orthodoxy a public ceremony that was both a beginning and an ending. She took the name Catherine, officially leaving Sophie behind forever. There was no going back to Germany now, no returning to the small duchy where she'd spent her childhood. The teenage girl who walked into that Russian court, wrapped in borrowed furs and speaking careful, practiced phrases, had already decided she wouldn't simply survive in this new world. She would master it. Every curtsy was a calculation, every smile was a strategy, every conversation was a chance to learn something useful. No one watching that quiet conversion ceremony could have imagined what this young German girl would become. The future stretched ahead of her, like an unwritten book, and Catherine was already planning to write it herself, one careful page at a time. Peter was the kind of husband you'd find in a cautionary tale. Here was a man destined to rule the largest empire on earth, yet he spent his days playing with toy soldiers like a child who'd never grown up. His new wife Catherine watched him arrange miniature armies on his bedroom floor, conducting elaborate battles that existed only in his imagination. While she tried to learn Russian customs and Orthodox prayers, he dreamed of Prussia and complained about everything Russian. It's almost tragic, really, how two people thrown together by politics could be so perfectly mismatched. The Russian court in those days was like a theater where everyone wore masks, and the wrong performance could cost you your life. Empress Elizabeth still held the throne, but whispers followed her everywhere about her failing health. Courtiers gathered in corners, making mental notes about who smiled at whom, who received letters from where, who might be useful when the inevitable transition came. Catherine found herself at the center of this dangerous dance, a young foreign woman whose every word was dissected, whose every friendship was analyzed for hidden meaning. You have to imagine what it felt like for her, thousands of miles from home, married to a man who seemed to actively dislike his own country. Her mother still tried to influence her from afar, representing interests that weren't necessarily Catherine's own. The servants couldn't be trusted. They reported everything back to someone. Even casual conversations carried weight in a world where today's ally might be tomorrow's accuser. Yet somehow, in this maze of suspicion and schemes, Catherine began to find her footing. She discovered something interesting about power. It responds to patience more than passion. While Peter threw tantrums and made demands, Catherine listened carefully and spoke thoughtfully. Military officers found themselves drawn to her quiet confidence. Scholars appreciated her genuine curiosity about ideas, and even hardened courtiers began to see something in her that they didn't see in her husband. She was building something slowly and deliberately, like constructing a house of cards in a windstorm. Those evening hours, when the court finally quieted down, Catherine would retreat to her chambers and read. Voltaire's letters about reason and justice, Montesquieu's thoughts on government and law, all these Enlightenment ideas that were reshaping Europe's understanding of what rulers should be. She wasn't just educating herself, she was imagining a different kind of Russia, one built on knowledge rather than fear, on progress rather than tradition alone. But between her and those dreams stood one significant obstacle. Her husband would have to become emperor first, and he showed no signs of stepping aside. Time moved strangely in those years of waiting. Catherine learned to measure months, not in seasons, but in small victories. A new ally here, a subtle shift in court opinion there. She watched Peter's reputation crumble bit by bit, his childish behavior becoming the subject of palace gossip, his obvious preference for Prussia over Russia raising eyebrows among patriotic nobles. Yet she knew that waiting for natural change might mean waiting forever, and forever was a luxury she couldn't afford in the brutal mathematics of royal succession. When Empress Elizabeth finally died in 1762, Peter's transformation from heir to emperor happened with ceremonial pomp and immediate disaster. You might think that finally having ultimate power would mature a person, force them to rise to the occasion. Instead, Peter seemed determined to prove every critic right. He offended the Orthodox Church with casual blasphemy, insulted noble families who'd served the crown for generations, and worst of all, he praised Frederick the Great while treating Russian military victories like embarrassments to be corrected. The speed of Peter's self-destruction was almost breathtaking to witness. In just a few months, he managed to alienate every major power center in Russian society. Church leaders muttered about his disrespect for sacred traditions, nobles grumbled about his favoritism toward foreigners, and army officers, men who'd bled for Russian soil, watched in disgust as their emperor celebrated their enemies. Catherine, meanwhile, had spent years cultivating relationships with exactly these groups, and they began looking to her with something approaching hope. The coup itself unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance that had been rehearsed for years without anyone quite realizing it. On a July morning in 1762, while Peter relaxed at his summer palace, Catherine appeared in St. Petersburg wearing the full regalia of Russian royalty. The Imperial Guard, those elite soldiers who could make or break any ruler, knelt before her not because they had to, but because they wanted. To military officers who'd grown tired of Peter's incompetence, rallied to her banner with enthusiasm that must have surprised even Catherine herself. What followed was perhaps the most anticlimactic end to a reign in Russian history. Peter, hearing that his wife had claimed his throne, seemed almost relieved to surrender. There were no dramatic battles, no siege of the palace, no last-minute reversals of fortune. Within days, the man who'd been Emperor of Russia was simply a prisoner, and shortly after that, he was dead. The official cause was listed as a sudden illness, but everyone understood the real story. In the harsh world of Russian politics, failed emperors rarely enjoyed long retirements. Catherine's victory represented something unprecedented in Russian history. A foreign-born woman with no blood claim to the throne had outmaneuvered every rival and seized power through intelligence rather than inheritance. But she was smart enough to know that winning a throne was only the beginning of the real work. Now she had to prove that her bold gamble could transform into something lasting, something that would benefit not just herself, but the vast empire she'd claimed as her own. The crown, once secured, presented Catherine with a choice that would define her legacy. She could have simply maintained what existed, collecting taxes and hosting court ceremonies like so many rulers before her. Instead, she chose transformation. The empress had fallen deeply in love with the writings of French philosophers, those bold thinkers who dared to question everything about how societies should work. Picture Catherine in her private chambers, candles flickering, as she reads letter after letter from Voltaire himself. For 15 years, these two exchanged thoughts across the vast distance between St. Petersburg and Paris. She flattered the old philosopher, while he praised her efforts to bring reason to the Russian wilderness. It was an unlikely friendship, really. This German princess turned Russian empress, and the sharp-tongued French writer who mocked kings and churches with equal enthusiasm. The empress didn't stop at reading philosophy books. She actually invited Denis Diderot, another famous thinker, to visit her court. When he needed money, she bought his entire personal library just to help him out. These weren't just gestures for show. Catherine genuinely believed that rulers should serve their people, even while holding absolute power over them. It was a contradiction that would follow her throughout her reign. Behind palace doors, something remarkable was happening. Catherine spent countless hours studying legal texts from other countries, trying to understand how laws could be fairer, more reasonable. In 1767, she created something called the Legislative Commission, bringing together representatives from across the empire to help rewrite Russia's entire legal system. Her own instruction manual for this project read like a revolutionary pamphlet, speaking of equality before the law and condemning torture as both cruel and useless. For an 18th century Russian empress, these ideas bordered on scandalous. Russia was still a land where nobles owned serfs like property, where torture was routine, where education was reserved for the wealthy few. Catherine knew she was walking a dangerous line, pushed too hard, too fast, and the powerful nobles who kept her on the throne might decide they needed a different empress. So she learned to balance like a performer on a tightrope. She abolished some of the worst forms of torture, but not all of them. She built schools and libraries, expanding education beyond the nobility, but carefully. Most tellingly, while she spoke of human dignity and rights, She actually strengthened the nobles' control over their serfs. It was a calculated trade, keeping the powerful happy while slowly introducing changes around the edges. This balancing act defined Catherine's approach to everything. She was a philosopher queen when writing letters to Paris intellectuals, a practical empress when dealing with Russian realities. The shining ideals of the Enlightenment had to survive in a vast conservative empire, where change came slowly or not at all. What Catherine was attempting wasn't simply copying Western Europe. She was trying to create a uniquely Russian version of modernity, reform delivered with what she called an iron hand in a velvet glove. Progress, yes, but always under her complete control. The Empress understood that internal reform alone wouldn't establish Russia as a true European power. She needed to expand outward, to claim territory and influence that would force other nations to take Russia seriously. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine decided to knock down entire walls. Her armies marched in multiple directions, but perhaps nowhere more significantly than against the Ottoman Empire. These weren't simple territorial grabs. Catherine saw herself as a liberator, freeing Orthodox Christians who had lived under Muslim rule for centuries. She positioned Russia as the natural protector of Eastern European peoples, a role that would echo through Russian foreign policy for generations. Under brilliant generals like Alexander Suvorov and Grigory Potemkin, Russian forces captured prize after prize. Crimea fell to Russian control, along with the northern shores of the Black Sea. Most importantly, Russia finally gained access to warm water ports, something Russian rulers had dreamed of for centuries. These victories weren't just lines on a map. They were declarations that Russia had arrived as a major power. Catherine also turned her attention westward, participating in what historians call the partitions of Poland. Through a series of diplomatic agreements with Austria and Prussia, the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was carved up like a feast. By 1795, Poland had disappeared entirely from European maps, and Russia had gained millions of new subjects, along with vast territories. But conquest through armies was only part of Catherine's strategy. She understood that lasting expansion required more than military victories. New cities rose from empty steppes, trade routes connected distant regions. German farmers were invited to settle Russian lands, bringing new agricultural techniques with them. The empire became a patchwork of peoples and cultures, stretching from Baltic ice to Black Sea warmth. Through all of this expansion, Catherine remained the central organizing force. She read military reports, issued detailed orders, and personally approved plans for new settlements. Critics accused her of naked imperialism, of caring more about power than people. But Catherine saw expansion differently. To her, a truly great ruler was measured not just by ideas and reforms, but by the scope of territory under their control. In her mind, she wasn't just conquering land, she was fulfilling Russia's destiny as a civilized empire. One that would be feared by enemies, respected by allies, and forever loyal to the Empress, who had transformed it from a backward kingdom into a continental force that could stand proudly alongside any European power. Behind the glittering facade of royal power, Catherine the Great lived a life that scandalized all of Europe. Her private chambers became the subject of endless whispers, endless fascination. The Empress didn't just rule with her mind, she ruled with her heart, and that made her enemies very uncomfortable indeed. You see, Catherine had lovers. Not just one discreet affair tucked away in palace corners. She had many of them, chosen with the same careful attention she gave to selecting generals or advisors. These men were often decades younger than her, handsome certainly, but more importantly, they were useful. Each relationship served a purpose, whether romantic, political, or both. What made Europe gasp was how openly she conducted these affairs. Other monarchs hid their indiscretions behind velvet curtains and sworn secrecy. Catherine practically paraded hers through the palace halls. When a romance ended, she didn't banish her former lovers to dungeons or distant provinces. Instead, she rewarded them with estates, titles, generous pensions. It was almost businesslike in its efficiency. Among all these relationships, one man stood apart from the rest. Gregory Potemkin entered Catherine's life like a force of nature, brilliant and bold in equal measure. Their connection transcended the usual boundaries between ruler and companion. Some whispers suggest they may have even married in secret, though history keeps that particular secret well guarded. Potemkin wasn't content to simply warm the Empress's bed and fade into comfortable obscurity. Together, they reshaped entire regions of the empire. Military campaigns were planned in intimate conversations. Colonization projects bloomed from their shared ambitions. Southern Russia itself was transformed through their partnership. He became, in many ways, her shadow ruler, the unseen hand guiding imperial policy. But Europe couldn't see past the scandal of it all. Satirical pamphlets flooded the continent, painting Catherine as some sort of insatiable creature, driven by lust rather than wisdom. The gossip mill churned endlessly, creating ever more outrageous stories about her private life. After her death, these rumors only grew wilder, culminating in one particularly grotesque lie involving a horse spread by enemies determined to destroy her reputation even in death. The obsession with Catherine's love life revealed something deeper about the world she inhabited. Here was a woman who refused to apologize for wielding power. In an age when female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins or tragic martyrs, Catherine chose a third path. She lived entirely on her own terms, and that terrified people. Ironically, while critics painted her as morally corrupt, Catherine herself held deeply philosophical views about love and pleasure. She believed that personal happiness was a natural right, that relationships didn't have to compromise public duty. Unlike many male rulers who let passion cloud their judgment, she maintained a clear separation between emotion and governance. The truth was far more strategic than scandalous. Catherine surrounded herself with men who were loyal, capable, and politically valuable. When they stopped being useful, she let them go with grace and generosity. Her love life didn't weaken her rule, it strengthened it, creating a network of devoted allies who owed their fortunes to her favor. This blend of passion and politics made Catherine unforgettable. It also made her dangerous to those who preferred their empresses, meek and controllable. She had turned romance itself into a tool of statecraft, and that innovation would outlast all the gossip and scandal that swirled around her name. But even the most careful ruler faces moments when control slips away like sand through fingers. For Catherine, that moment came in 1773, when a bearded Cossack named Yemlian Pugachev emerged from the wilderness with an impossible claim. He declared himself to be Peter III, Catherine's supposedly dead husband, miraculously returned to reclaim his stolen throne. The claim was absurd on its face. Peter was long buried, his death well documented, but truth mattered less than hope to Russia's suffering masses. Pugachev promised everything they desperately wanted to hear. An end to serfdom, lower taxes, land for common people, freedom from the crushing weight of noble oppression. His words spread like wildfire across the Volga River region. Cossacks, peasants, religious minorities, all the forgotten people of the empire, flocked to his banner. In a society where the gap between rich and poor had become a chasm, Pugachev's promises sounded like salvation itself. What followed became the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns fell, fortresses were overrun, nobles were dragged from their estates and killed. For terrifying weeks, it seemed the empire itself might shatter into pieces. This wasn't some foreign invasion Catherine could repel with clever diplomacy or superior military tactics. This was her own people rising against everything she represented. The rebellion shook Catherine to her core. Here was a crisis that couldn't be solved with enlightened philosophy or rational discourse. This was raw anger, generations of suffering finally boiling over into violence. The empress, who prided herself on understanding her subjects, suddenly faced the uncomfortable reality of how little she truly knew about their pain. But Catherine didn't collapse under pressure. She acted with characteristic decisiveness, dispatching professional military forces to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force. By 1774, Pugachev's ragtag army was defeated. The man himself was captured, displayed in an iron cage like some exotic beast, then publicly beheaded in Moscow as a warning to potential imitators. The aftermath changed Catherine profoundly. Her youthful dreams of liberating the serfs quietly disappeared into palace filing cabinets. The rebellion had shown her the dangerous limits of enlightenment in a country still chained to feudalism. Reform, she realized, was a luxury she could no longer afford. Instead, she leaned harder on the nobility, offering them even greater control over their serfs in exchange for unwavering loyalty. The empress who once quoted Voltaire now prioritized stability over philosophy. Surveillance networks expanded, whispered dissent was crushed before it could take root. Pugachev lost his head, but his ghost haunted the rest of Catherine's reign. He had delivered a warning that no amount of imperial power could silence, that empires built on inequality carry the seeds of their own destruction, and that even the mightiest throne rests on foundations that can crack when the earth beneath them shifts. Picture a woman who wasn't born to rule, yet somehow became one of the most powerful monarchs in history. Catherine arrived in Russia as a foreign princess, speaking no Russian, understanding little of the vast empire she would one day command. It's a curious thing how someone can reshape an entire world simply through the force of their will. For over 30 years, she held the throne of the largest country on earth. Think about that for a moment. 30 years of making decisions that affected millions of people. 30 years of balancing enemies and allies. 30 years of waking up each morning, knowing that one wrong move could cost her everything. No woman had ever ruled Russia for so long. The maps of Europe tell her story in bold strokes. Under her guidance, Russia swallowed up more than 200,000 square miles of new territory. Crimea fell under Russian control, chunks of Poland were absorbed, and the Black Sea coast became Russian soil. These weren't just conquests for the sake of glory. Each piece of land served a purpose, opening up trade routes, securing ports that didn't freeze in winter, connecting Russia to the wider world in ways it had never been connected before. But land is just dirt and stone unless you know what to do with it. Catherine understood this. She looked at her empire and saw not just territory, but possibility. In a time when most of Europe saw Russia as a backward, almost barbaric place, she decided to change that perception entirely. The Hermitage Museum began as her private collection, room after room of the finest art Europe could offer. She didn't just buy paintings and sculptures, she gathered one of the greatest art collections on the continent. Imagine walking through those halls, seeing masterpiece after masterpiece, knowing that a single woman had assembled all of this beauty under one roof. Her correspondence reads like a who's who of Enlightenment thinking. The greatest minds of the age wrote to her, shared ideas with her, treated her as an intellectual equal. This wasn't common for monarchs, and it certainly wasn't expected from a ruler of Russia. Yet there she was, exchanging letters with philosophers and thinkers, bringing their ideas into her court, making Russia a center of intellectual life. Education fascinated her in ways that seem almost modern. She founded schools specifically for girls, understanding that half the population had been ignored for far too long. Books became more common under her rule as printing expanded. Knowledge, she believed, should flow freely through her empire. Even medicine caught her attention. When smallpox inoculation was still viewed with suspicion and fear, Catherine took the vaccine publicly. Picture that scene, the Empress of all Russia rolling up her sleeve to receive an experimental medical treatment, knowing that her example might save countless lives. Yet for all her progressive ideas, Catherine lived with contradictions that she never fully resolved. She admired Enlightenment ideals of freedom and human dignity, but she never freed the serfs. In fact, serfdom expanded under her rule, reaching deeper into Russian territories than ever before. Perhaps she believed that change had to come slowly, or perhaps she understood that some changes would threaten the very foundations of her power. This tension between ideals and reality shaped much of her reign. Her reforms were impressive, sweeping changes that modernized many aspects of Russian life. But they came from above, imposed by imperial decree, rather than growing from the people themselves. She polished the empire's surface, while leaving its deepest structures largely untouched. Power, Catherine learned, is never given freely. It must be seized, cultivated, and defended every single day. She didn't rule by divine right, the way kings and queens were supposed to. Instead, she ruled through intelligence, political skill, and an almost ruthless ability to calculate what needed to be done. Every decision was weighed, every alliance carefully considered, every enemy methodically dealt with. People called her many things during her lifetime. Some saw her as a usurper who had stolen the throne. Others labeled her a tyrant, crushing opposition without mercy. Still others praised her as a reformer who brought Russia into the modern world. Whispers followed her everywhere, stories about her personal life that were often more fiction than fact. But above all these labels, one thing remained clear. She was effective. When Catherine died in 1796, she left behind a Russia that was barely recognizable from the one she had inherited. The empire was wealthier, larger, and more respected than it had been in centuries. The throne she passed on was secure, the nobility was loyal, and Russia's place among the great powers of Europe was unquestioned. Behind all the imperial grandeur lived a woman who understood exactly how precarious her position really was. She wasn't Russian by birth. She had taken power through a coup, and she ruled over people who had never wanted a woman on the throne. Every day of her reign was an act of defiance against those who believed she didn't belong there. Her daily routine would exhaust most people. Hours spent reading reports from across the vast empire, writing correspondence with foreign leaders, editing state documents, managing a court full of ambitious and often dangerous people. She never treated the throne as a comfortable chair to sit in. Instead, she worked at being empress with the dedication of someone who knew that laziness meant losing everything. Loneliness shadowed her throughout her reign. Courts are filled with people, but finding someone to trust becomes almost impossible when you hold ultimate power. Her memoirs reveal a woman who understood that almost everyone around her wanted something from her. Even her own son Paul grew into someone she couldn't trust, someone she feared might undo all the progress she had made. Her greatest love, Gregory Potemkin, understood her in ways that few others ever did. Their romantic relationship eventually transformed into a deep friendship built on mutual respect and shared ambitions. When he died in 1791, Catherine lost not just a companion, but her closest confidant. The grief never fully left her. Image mattered to Catherine in ways that modern leaders would recognize immediately. She understood that power isn't just about making decisions, it's about how people perceive those decisions. She crafted different roles for herself depending on what the moment required. Sometimes she was the mother of Russia, caring for her subjects like children. Other times, she was the enlightened monarch, bringing reason and progress to her empire. She could be the warrior empress when military action was needed, or the patron of arts when culture required attention. Yet beneath all these carefully constructed roles lived a woman who had survived rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion. Each challenge that should have destroyed her instead made her more determined to prove that she belonged exactly where she was. When historians look back at Catherine's reign, questions remain. Could she have done more to free the serfs? Were her enlightened ideals genuine, or simply tools to improve Russia's reputation? Was she primarily a reformer trying to improve life for her subjects, or a ruler focused on maintaining and expanding her own power? History gave her a title she never claimed for herself: the Great. It wasn't because she was perfect, or kind, or always just in her decisions. She earned that title because she took power in a world that didn't believe women should have any, and then used that power to reshape an empire according to her own vision. She didn't just wear a crown, she redefined what it meant to deserve one. Deep in the Mexican jungle, where humidity clings to everything like an ancient secret, there once lived a civilization that understood something profound about death. The Maya didn't see dying as an ending, but rather as, well, a doorway into something far more mysterious. Picture this, if you will. The year is 1994, and a team of archaeologists is wandering through the ruins of Palenque, brushing dirt off stones that have been sleeping for over 1,000 years. They're looking at Temple 19. Nothing too fancy, just another pyramid sitting quietly next to its more famous neighbors. But sometimes the most incredible discoveries hide in the most ordinary places. These researchers notice something odd, a sealed chamber that nobody has touched. Not even the grave robbers who usually get there first. When they finally break through, the air inside feels heavy, thick with centuries of waiting. And there, in the darkness, sits a stone coffin, patient as eternity itself. Now, imagine opening that coffin and seeing, not gold or silver, but a cloud of brilliant red dust rising into the air like some kind of ancient smoke signal. Everything inside glows crimson, the walls, the bones, even the air seems tinted with this shocking, vibrant red. It's cinnabar, powdered mercury sulfide, and it's covering absolutely everything. The Maya had this fascinating relationship with red, you see. To them it wasn't just a color, it was life itself. Blood and sunrise and rebirth all rolled into one sacred hue. They crushed this mercury mineral into powder, not knowing it was toxic, only knowing it felt powerful, dangerous, divine. When someone died covered in cinnabar, it meant they weren't just being buried, they were being transformed. And there, lying in this crimson cloud, was a woman. Her skeleton still wore a jade mask, delicate as butterfly wings but eternal as stone. Around her neck, jade necklaces caught what little light filtered down from above. Her ears still held jade ornaments. Her wrists were circled with jade bracelets. The Maya believed jade was the breath of gods, the green of life, the promise that death was just another kind of growing. What strikes you most about this discovery, though, is the silence. No name carved anywhere, no glyphs telling her story, no inscriptions bragging about her achievements. Whoever she was meant to be remembered through mystery, through ritual, through the questions she left behind, rather than the answers. The archaeologists called her the Red Queen, and somehow that name feels perfect. She ruled over questions, over possibilities, over the space between knowing and wondering. Was she a priestess who spoke to gods? A queen who commanded armies? The wife of Pakal the Great, that mighty king whose own tomb lies nearby, also drenched in sacred red? Her burial tells us something beautiful about how the ancient Maya understood power. They didn't always need to shout about it, didn't always need to carve it in stone for everyone to see. Sometimes, the most profound influence whispers through ceremony, through color, through the care with which someone prepares for their journey beyond life. Around her bones, they found bone needles and obsidian blades, tools that might have been used for ritual bloodletting or healing ceremonies. The Maya believed that drawing blood connected the human world to the divine realm, that through small sacrifices, mortals could speak with gods. Perhaps she was a healer, drawing illness from bodies like pulling thorns from flesh. Perhaps she was a visionary, using sacred pain to glimpse the future. At her feet sat ceramic vessels, still sealed after 13 centuries, probably once filled with food and drink for her journey to Zababa, the Maya underworld. Death, to these people, wasn't a destination but a voyage, complete with dangers and challenges, and the need for provisions. They imagined the afterlife as layered, complex, requiring navigation skills and spiritual supplies. What's haunting is how intentional everything feels. Nothing random, nothing wasteful, just carefully chosen objects arranged with the precision of someone who truly believed this woman would need them in whatever came next. A jade mask to preserve her identity among the gods, necklaces heavy with the weight of eternal life, tools for whatever work awaited her beyond the veil. The cinnabar itself tells such a story. We know now that mercury is poisonous, that prolonged exposure causes tremors, hallucinations, even death. The Maya didn't understand the chemistry, but they felt its power, sensed its danger. To cover someone completely in this toxic red powder was to declare them no ordinary mortal, but someone capable of handling divine forces that would destroy lesser beings. Only the most sacred dead received this treatment. Pakal the Great, the ruler whose pyramid dominates Palenque, was buried in Cinnabar too. That connection alone sparks the imagination. Were they husband and wife, ruling together over this jungle kingdom, mother and son, bound by blood and divine authority? Or perhaps something more mysterious, two souls, chosen by the gods for purposes we can barely guess at. Her skull rested on jaguar skin, another sacred symbol. Jaguars moved between worlds, in Maya belief, equally at home in jungle shadows and underworld darkness. They were the shamans of the animal kingdom, creatures who understood secrets hidden from ordinary eyes. To rest her head on jaguar fur was to mark her as someone who, like those great cats, could walk between realms. The tomb's isolation adds another layer to the mystery. Unlike other royal burials, hers was hidden, separate, deliberately concealed. She wasn't meant for public veneration or political propaganda. Her power was private, spiritual, connected to forces that didn't need earthly recognition to be real. Even the way archaeologists found her speaks to this theme of hidden influence. While tourists flocked to see Pakal's famous tomb, the Red Queen waited in darkness, patient and overlooked, her story preserved not in carved boasts, but in the careful arrangement of sacred objects, in the ritual red that painted her bones like sunrise. There's something deeply moving about encountering mystery, this profound, this carefully preserved. In our world of instant information and documented everything, here's a story that refuses to be fully told, a woman whose identity remains as elusive as smoke, as present as the red dust that marked her passage from this world to whatever lies beyond. The jade mask over her face, assembled from dozens of tiny mosaic pieces, mirrors the way her story comes to us, fragment by fragment, beautiful but incomplete. Each piece catches light differently, suggests different possibilities, different ways of understanding who she might have been, and why her burial mattered enough to preserve with such elaborate care. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones without names. Deep in the ancient ruins of a Maya city, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. A woman, buried with all the ceremony of royalty, yet her identity remains wrapped in mystery. They call her the Red Queen now because of the brilliant red powder that covered her remains. Cinnabar, a mineral sacred to the Maya, painted her bones crimson for over 1,000 years. She lay there in darkness, waiting to tell her story. Picture this scene, if you will. The year was around 700 AD, somewhere in the dense jungles of what we now call Mexico. A great civilization thrived there, building pyramids that touched the sky, writing in glyphs we're still learning to read. And in this world, a woman of incredible importance was being laid to rest. Her burial tells us everything and nothing, all at once. The tomb was carved deep into a pyramid, accessible only by a narrow staircase that winds down like a passage to another realm. Stone walls surrounded her, bare of the inscriptions that usually proclaimed royal names and deeds, but silence can speak volumes too. The Maya believed death was not an ending, but a transformation. The red cinnabar covering her bones wasn't just decoration, it was preparation. This sacred mineral was thought to help souls journey between worlds, from the realm of the living to the realm of the ancestors. Her sarcophagus sat like an altar in that stone chamber, carved from limestone, solid and eternal. Around her, they placed jade jewelry, the green stone more precious than gold to the Maya. A jade mask covered her face, transforming her features into those of a goddess. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Just a few feet away, in another pyramid, lay one of the most famous Maya rulers ever discovered. They call him Pakal, the Great today. His tomb was grand, covered in glyphs that tell his life story in detail. But our Red Queen, she rests in deliberate anonymity, Think about what that means. In a culture that carved names into stone, that celebrated rulers with towering monuments, someone chose to bury this woman without identification. Was it intentional? Was her power so understood, so absolute, that no introduction was needed? The proximity of their tombs suggests a connection. Husband and wife, perhaps, ruling together in life, resting together in eternity. Only 2 burials in this ancient city were found covered in such intense cinnabar, his and hers, in a civilization that left little to chance. This wasn't coincidence. Scientists tried to solve the mystery with modern tools. They extracted DNA from ancient bones, hoping to map family connections. But the results raised more questions than answers. No direct maternal link between the rulers, but that doesn't rule out marriage. Blood doesn't determine every relationship, after all. Some scholars believe she might have been Pakal's wife, a queen named Tizagbu Ajau. Others suggest she could have been his mother, Sutkuk, a powerful woman who ruled in her own right before her son came of age. The truth remains elusive, floating somewhere between evidence and imagination. What we do know is this: Maya women held far more power than many people realize. They weren't silent figures standing behind great men. They were rulers, diplomats, priestesses. They conducted sacred ceremonies, sponsored temple construction, forged political alliances through marriage and blood. Royal women were living links between dynasties. Their bloodlines carried political weight. Their marriages sealed treaties. Their children secured thrones. They appeared in ancient art wearing elaborate headdresses, standing as equals beside kings, sometimes towering above them. Take Sako Cook, Pakal's mother, as an example. When the throne sat empty, she didn't step aside for a male relative. She took power herself, ruled for years, made decisions that shaped the kingdom's future. She was no placeholder, but a sovereign in her own right. Across the Maya world, inscriptions record women leading armies, conducting diplomacy, performing the sacred bloodletting rituals that connected earth to heaven. Their names were carved in stone, their deeds remembered in songs, until time and conquest erased so much of their legacy. The Spanish colonizers who arrived centuries later saw indigenous women through their own cultural lens. They expected quiet, subservient figures and wrote history accordingly. But archaeology tells a different story, one of complex societies where power flowed in unexpected directions. This context transforms how we see our Red Queen. Her rich burial, her sacred placement, her jade mask, all suggest she was central to the royal order. Perhaps her bloodline held the dynasty together. Perhaps her rituals maintained cosmic balance. Perhaps her political wisdom guided kingdom policy. The architecture of her tomb speaks its own language. Built deep within Temple 13, her resting place mirrors the cosmic geography of Maya belief. Temples weren't just buildings, they were spiritual machines, designed to facilitate journeys between worlds. Her chamber aligns east to west, following the sun's daily path from birth to death to rebirth. The descent to reach her tomb feels symbolic, like walking into the underworld itself. Narrow stairs wind downward through darkness, leading to her sealed sanctuary. The chamber itself is intimate, personal. Where Pakal's tomb celebrates his achievements with elaborate carvings, hers embraces powerful simplicity. The focus turns inward, toward transformation rather than declaration, toward mystery rather than explanation. Maya cosmology viewed temples as bridges connecting heaven, earth, and underworld. To be buried within one was to be elevated beyond ordinary human existence. The Red Queen's architectural shrine speaks without words, telling us she belonged to this elevated realm. Her sarcophagus sits at the chamber's heart like a sacred altar. The limestone was carefully chosen, expertly carved, built to last millennia. Every detail was planned, every element meaningful, every choice deliberate. The tomb remained sealed for over 11 centuries, protecting its secrets from looters and time. When archaeologists finally opened it, they found preservation so perfect it seemed magical. The cinnabar still glowed red, the jade still gleamed green, the bones still held their stories. Modern science has given us new ways to read these ancient tales. We can analyze mineral compositions, trace trade routes, map DNA relationships. But some mysteries resist our tools, demanding we accept uncertainty, embrace questions without easy answers. Perhaps that's fitting. The Maya understood that some truths transcend names and dates. Their creation myths speak of cycles within cycles, of death leading to rebirth, of silence that carries more meaning than words. The Red Queen embodies this paradox. Nameless, yet unforgettable, silent, yet eloquent, mysterious, yet revealing. She represents all the powerful women whose stories history failed to preserve, whose influence shaped worlds we're still discovering. Her jade mask transforms her face into something eternal, something divine. In Maya belief, jade connected the living to the ancestors, the earthly to the celestial. Wearing it in death meant joining the gods, becoming part of the sacred landscape that guided human destiny. The cinnabar that colors her bones red speaks of transformation, of souls traveling between realms. This wasn't preservation for its own sake, but preparation for the next stage of existence. Death as doorway, burial as birth, tomb as cocoon. Standing in that chamber today, you can feel the weight of intention, the power of belief made manifest in stone and mineral and carefully placed jade. This woman, whoever she was, commanded resources and reverence that few people in any era could claim. Her story reminds us that history often hides its most interesting characters. The ones who worked behind scenes, who wielded influence without fanfare, who shaped events through relationships and wisdom rather than warfare and monuments. The Red Queen sleeps in her crimson shroud, keeper of secrets we may never fully unlock. But perhaps that's her final gift to us, the reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. Some stories are meant to be felt rather than solved. Some truths are meant to be discovered in the space between questions and answers. There's something almost magical about the moment when ancient silence finally breaks. Imagine a woman whose name vanished 13 centuries ago, yet whose presence still commands attention today. The ancient Maya understood something profound about death, something we might have forgotten in our modern world. They saw it not as an ending, but as a doorway, a sacred passage that connected this world to something far greater. When the Maya buried their most important people, they weren't just saying goodbye. They were preparing these souls for an incredible journey through Xibalba, their underworld. This wasn't some peaceful resting place. Mind you, Xibalba was dangerous, filled with rivers of blood, tests of courage, and gods who delighted in trickery. Only those who were properly prepared, ritually equipped, and spiritually strong could navigate its twisting paths. Deep within Temple 13, at Paleng, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. A woman, wrapped entirely in brilliant red cinnabar, the color of life itself. Her bones had absorbed this crimson powder over centuries, earning her the name we know her by today, the Red Queen. But this red coating wasn't just decoration. In Maya belief, red represented blood, sacrifice, and the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Every detail of her burial tells a story of careful preparation. Jade mask pieces covered her face, not for vanity, but for spiritual necessity. The Maya believed your face was a mirror of your soul, and the gods needed to recognize you in the afterlife. Without this jade mask, she might wander Xibalba forever, lost and unidentified in that maze of shadows. Around her body lay ceramic vessels, once filled with chocolate, corn, water, maybe even pulque, that fermented drink the Maya cherished. These weren't grave goods in our modern sense. They were provisions, spiritual nourishment, for an incredibly long journey. Stingray spines and obsidian blades hint at bloodletting rituals, sacred acts of communication between the human and divine worlds. Bone needles suggest she may have been involved in textile work, weaving not just cloth but perhaps the very fabric of ritual life. Shell trumpets could call to the gods across vast spiritual distances. Every object placed with her had meaning, purpose, spiritual power. What makes her story even more fascinating is where she was found, just steps away from the most famous tomb in all of Mesoamerica, that of Kinix-Janab Pakal, known simply as Pakal the Great. In a city like Palenque, every stone was placed according to cosmic principles. This proximity wasn't accidental. It was intentional, a statement carved in architecture itself. Both rulers were wrapped in shinabar, both entombed in pyramids, both surrounded by jade and treated with extraordinary reverence. Their burial rituals mirror each other, like two halves of some sacred narrative. If Pakal represented the sun, journeying through the underworld each night, to rise again, then perhaps the Red Queen embodied the moon, that mysterious feminine force following its own celestial path. The Maya understood something we're still learning. Rulership wasn't singular, it was relational. Harmony in the cosmos required balance, and that balance extended into royal courts. Kings and queens weren't just political partners, they were cosmic ones, maintaining the delicate equilibrium between earth and sky, human and divine. Many scholars believe the Red Queen was Dizakbu, Ajau, Pakal's queen and trusted consort. While her tomb lacks the elaborate inscriptions of her possible husband, the similarities in their treatment speak volumes. They lie in eternal proximity. Two souls wrapped in cinnabar and stone, joined across centuries in one of history's most sacred silences. Her burial reflects something profound about Maya women. They weren't passive figures in this ancient world. They led rituals, governed cities, shaped dynasties. While kings like Pakal have long dominated our historical narratives, the Red Queen's emergence reminds us that power flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. The Maya believed in cycles, endless spirals of death and rebirth. Death was like planting a seed, burial was the nurturing earth, and the afterlife was the flowering that followed. Kings and queens were seen as earthly incarnations of gods, and in death they returned to those divine origins. The Red Queen, covered in the color of blood, entombed in her pyramid, honored with offerings, was being prepared not for ending, but for transformation. What's extraordinary about her story isn't just what we know, but what remains mysterious. No glyph carved her name into stone, no stela proclaimed her achievements. Yet, the care in her burial, the richness of her offerings, the symbolism of her crimson bones, all speak of someone profoundly important, not merely as a wife or consort, but as someone who held real influence, spiritual weight, royal authority. Today, 13 centuries after her death, the Red Queen forces us to reconsider our assumptions about the ancient world. She represents the countless women whose names were lost, but whose power was real. Every jade bead in her tomb, every layer of cinnabar on her bones, every architectural choice in Temple 13 tells us something deliberate. This woman mattered, perhaps more than we'll ever fully understand. There's something beautiful about mysteries that refuse to be completely solved. The Red Queen teaches us that history isn't just facts and dates. It's a living puzzle, a shared human longing to connect across impossible distances of time. Her legacy continues unfolding with each new discovery, each fresh interpretation, each moment someone pauses to wonder about her story. She lies wrapped in red, that color of life and sacrifice, blood and rebirth. Her face, once hidden behind jade tiles, now stares back at us through science and imagination. She remains nameless but not voiceless, mysterious but certainly not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death she rules something greater. Our endless fascination with the past. Her tomb was sealed in stone, her story written in silence. And still, somehow, across 13 centuries, she speaks. There's something almost mystical about how pain can transform a person, how the worst moments in life sometimes become the doorways to the most extraordinary discoveries. Picture a young woman, barely 18, whose entire world shifted in a matter of seconds on an ordinary afternoon in Mexico City. The Blue House in Coyoacán held secrets long before it became famous. This wasn't just any house. This was a place where colors seemed to live and breathe, where every room told a different story. The walls had witnessed the birth of 4 daughters to parents who couldn't have been more different from each other. Guillermo, the father, carried the quiet intensity of his German-Hungarian roots. He saw the world through a photographer's lens, always observing, always thinking. His wife Mathilde moved through life with the steady rhythm of deep faith, her indigenous and Spanish blood flowing with traditions older than memory itself. She kept her emotions locked away, like treasures in a chest that rarely opened. Their 3rd daughter inherited something from each parent, a combination that would prove both blessing and burden. From her father came that artist's eye, that way of seeing beneath the surface of things. From her mother came a strength that could bend without breaking, a resilience that would be tested in ways no parent could imagine. Even as a small child, this girl was different. She devoured books the way other children devoured candy. Her questions came rapid fire, the kind that made adults shift uncomfortably and change the subject. She had that rare quality of being completely herself, even when the world suggested she should be someone else. When polio arrived at her door, as uninvited as winter, it left its mark on her right leg. For months, she lay in bed while other children played outside. But instead of breaking her spirit, the isolation seemed to concentrate it, like sunlight through a magnifying glass. Her father, understanding something others missed, encouraged her to move, to think, to refuse the limitations that illness tried to impose. At 15, when most girls her age were learning to be proper ladies, she walked through the doors of the National Preparatory School. She was one of only a handful of girls in a world designed for boys. But she didn't tiptoe through those halls. She strode through them with purpose. The Kachuchas, they called themselves, this group of young thinkers who gathered to debate the big questions: philosophy, literature, politics, revolution. Nothing was off limits. She found her people among these rebels and dreamers, these young minds that refused to accept the world as it was handed to them. Revolution wasn't just a concept to discuss. It was something that called to her blood. She wanted to heal people, to become a doctor, to spend her life mending what was broken. The irony of what was coming would not be lost on history. September 17th, 1825, a date that would split one life into before and afternoons like this. One happened every day, students boarding buses, couples teasing each other, the ordinary rhythm of young love and daily life continuing, as it always had. The wooden bus creaked and swayed through the streets of Mexico City, carrying its passengers toward destinations they would never reach, not in the way they had planned. The streetcar appeared like fate itself, unstoppable and absolute. Metal met wood, momentum met immovable object, and in that collision, everything changed. Physics became poetry, of the most terrible kind. Bodies flew through space, following laws of motion that cared nothing for dreams or futures. The iron handrail moved like a spear through time, entering her left hip, exiting through her life in an instant. Her spinal column, that crucial highway between brain and body, fractured in 3 places. Her right leg, already weakened by childhood illness, shattered like glass. Bones that had carried her through 15 years of life suddenly became obstacles to survival. Her collarbone, her ribs, her shoulder, all broken. Her abdomen pierced, her foot twisted from its proper place. But perhaps the most haunting detail was the gold powder, the cosmetic dust that had exploded from her purse and covered her broken form like stardust. As if the universe had decided to make this tragedy beautiful, in the way that only the universe can, with a touch both cruel and magnificent. The Red Cross Hospital became her new world, a place of white walls and endless procedures. Surgery followed surgery, each one a negotiation with her body, a plea for it to remember how to be whole. The body cast held her like a cocoon, but instead of emerging as a butterfly, she was learning to become something else entirely, something the world had never seen before. Her father understood what she needed before she did. The brushes appeared first, then the special easel that could hover above a bed. Her mother, practical as always, arranged the mirror on the canopy so that reflection could become subject, so that the act of seeing oneself could become the act of creation. Those first brushstrokes must have felt like whispers, tentative attempts to speak a language she was only beginning to learn. But what emerged wasn't tentative at all. It was bold, honest, sometimes shocking in its refusal to look away from truth. Self-portraits became her specialty, not from vanity, but from necessity. She painted herself because she was often alone, yes, but also because she was discovering that she was the subject she knew best. Every line in her face, every shadow of pain, every flicker of defiance, all of it became material for art. The Mexican tradition of retablos, those small devotional paintings that told stories of suffering and miraculous intervention, found new life in her hands. But instead of saints and miracles, she painted herself as both victim and survivor, martyr and witness to her own experience. Her body became a map of trauma, but also a landscape of resilience. She painted herself split down the middle, held together by nothing but will. She painted herself floating above barren ground, tethered to a broken column that represented her damaged spine. The imagery was medical and mythical, at once, clinical and deeply spiritual. Pain, in her hands, became a language with its own grammar and syntax. She painted tears that looked like rivers, blood that bloomed like flowers, wounds that opened like doorways to understanding. Nothing was sanitized or made pretty for the comfort of viewers. This was raw truth, beautiful in its honesty. But there was humor too, a dark wit that refused to let suffering become sacred in the wrong way. She painted herself with a monkey on her shoulder, with roots growing from her body, with two hearts visible in her chest. The surreal became normal, the impossible became everyday reality. Her art drew from Mexican folk traditions, from European surrealism, from medical textbooks, from dreams and nightmares alike. Each painting was like an autopsy of the soul, but performed by the patient herself, with full knowledge of what she might find inside. By the time she could walk again, though walking would always mean pain, she had become something new. The girl who wanted to heal others had learned to heal herself through art. The student who dreamed of medicine had discovered a different kind of healing, one that worked through color and symbol, rather than scalpel and suture. She had taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and transformed it into something unprecedented. Her paintings forced the world to look at pain differently, to see suffering not as something to hide or fix quickly, but as a part of human experience deserving of attention, of beauty, of respect. This was just the beginning of a story that would grow larger than anyone could imagine. The Blue House would see more transformation, more art, more pain, and more triumph. But it all started here, in a hospital bed, with a young woman who refused to let tragedy have the final word in her story. Picture a young woman, barely into her 20s, still healing from an accident that changed everything. Freda had already learned that life could shift in an instant, that the body could betray you when you least expected it. She was painting now, finding something in the colors and canvas that spoke to her restless spirit. But she needed to know if what she was creating mattered, if it had any real worth beyond her own wounded world. The man she sought out was already a legend in Mexico. Diego Rivera stood like a mountain among artists, his reputation built on massive murals that covered entire walls. He was famous for painting the story of his people, bold strokes that captured revolution and struggle on an enormous scale. 20 years separated them in age, a generation that felt like centuries in experience. When Freda appeared at the Ministry of Education, she interrupted his work without ceremony, without politeness. She simply asked if she had talent, the kind of blunt question that cuts through everything unnecessary. Diego looked at her paintings and saw something that couldn't be taught or faked. Raw honesty lived in her brushstrokes, the kind of voice that comes from someone who has stared directly into pain and refused to look away. He recognized the rage and beauty mixed together, the irony that only comes from surviving what should have destroyed you. This recognition became the beginning of something that would consume them both. Their relationship began like a storm, gathering on the horizon, slow at first, then overwhelming everything in its path. In 1929, they married, creating one of those partnerships that seems impossible from the outside. Here was this massive man, already notorious for his affairs, his political fame, his larger-than-life presence. And here was Freda, sharp-tongued and fiercely independent, already walking with a cane, already carrying more pain than most people twice her age. Her parents saw them together and thought of an elephant paired with a dove. A union that seemed destined for chaos. The chaos came, as it always does, in waves. Diego encouraged her painting, pushed her to grow as an artist, believed in her vision when others might have dismissed it. But he also carried his appetites like weapons, cutting her down with betrayals that struck at the heart of everything she thought they shared. When he had an affair with her own sister, Cristina, the wound went deeper than any physical injury she had ever endured. Freda learned that emotional pain could be just as crippling as any accident. But Freda Kahlo was not someone who accepted wounds without returning them. She took lovers of her own, both men and women, creating her own web of passion and rebellion. Whispers followed her about affairs with political figures and fellow artists, including the famous Georgia O'Keeffe. These relationships became part of her armor, her way of claiming power in a world that tried to reduce her to victim or wife. By 1939, their marriage had fractured completely, divorce papers marking the end of what had once seemed unbreakable. Yet something pulled them back together within a year, though this time on different terms. Freda demanded her autonomy, her own home, her own money, her own name. This second marriage became less about traditional love and more about creative partnership. Two artists who understood each other's demons, even when they couldn't live peacefully together. The 1930s brought travel to the United States, following Diego as he painted murals in San Francisco, Detroit, and New York. For Freda, these cities represented everything she found troubling about capitalism and American culture. Here was enormous wealth existing alongside devastating poverty during the Great Depression. The contradictions gnawed at her communist beliefs, her Mexican nationalism, her love for indigenous traditions. In letters home, she wrote with sharp criticism about American materialism, the obsession with appearances over substance. While Diego created enormous public works on factory walls, Freda turned inward, painting smaller revolutions on tin and canvas. Her style crystallized during these years abroad, becoming sharp, surreal, and intensely personal. She discovered that her own face, her own body, her own pain could become the landscape for everything she wanted to say about survival and resistance. Her self-portraits weren't exercises in vanity, but acts of survival, ways of claiming her own narrative when everything else seemed beyond her control. Her body constantly betraying her with pain from surgeries and failed pregnancies became the subject she knew most intimately. She painted herself bleeding, fragmented, exposed, yet always with that direct gaze that refused to apologize for existing. One of her most devastating works showed her on a hospital bed in Detroit, tears on her cheeks, surrounded by floating symbols of loss, a fetus, medical equipment, a cracked pelvis, a snail, all connected to her by red ribbons like some terrible umbilical cord. The painting bled with truth, the kind of raw honesty that made viewers uncomfortable because it demanded they witness pain without the comfort of distance or metaphor. Back in Mexico, politics and art intertwined in her daily life like threads in a tapestry. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home. During his exile, their house becoming a gathering place for revolutionary thinkers. Freda wore traditional Tijuana dresses not just for their beauty, but as political statements, ways of honoring indigenous culture in a world increasingly dominated by European influences. Her paintings during this time carried the weight of her beliefs, her body, her complicated relationship with identity. While Diego painted grand visions of revolution, Freda painted its human cost, the way political struggle lived in individual bodies. in personal pain, in the fragments of self that had to be constantly reassembled. Her art became a form of resistance, not just against political oppression, but against the expectation that suffering should be hidden, that pain should be private, that women should be quiet about the wars fought within their own bodies. The journey back to Mexico in the late 30s brought with it a transformation that went far beyond geography. Here was an artist who had finally stepped out of any shadow, ready to claim her own space in the world. The cobalt blue house in Coyoacán became more than just a home. It was a living canvas where imagination took physical form. Picture this sanctuary, where ancient Aztec sculptures shared garden space with chattering monkeys, where parrots flew freely among the vibrant yellow trim. Every corner told a story. Every room breathed with the weight of history and the lightness of creative spirit. Pre-Columbian artifacts sat alongside revolutionary literature, creating conversations across centuries. The transformation wasn't just in her surroundings, but in her very presence. Those flowing Tijuana dresses became her uniform, flowers woven into dark hair like natural crowns. The air around her creative space filled with copal incense, mixing the sacred with the everyday, while mariachi music drifted in from the streets beyond those famous blue walls. This homecoming sparked something extraordinary in her work. The paintings grew more complex, layered with symbols that spoke in a language deeper than words. Take that haunting piece, showing two versions of herself, sitting side by side like a conversation between worlds. One figure wore European clothing, heart exposed and bleeding, while the other sat strong in indigenous dress. It was autobiography written in brushstrokes, a visual diary of identity split between cultures. The art world took notice. Paris in 1939 saw her work displayed among the great names of the era, with established artists recognizing something fierce and original in her vision. But when critics tried to box her into existing movements, she pushed back with characteristic directness. Dreams weren't her subject matter, she insisted. Reality was her canvas. Her Mexico wasn't the postcard version tourists expected. Instead, she painted the breathing, complex nation she knew intimately. Hummingbirds and skeletons, corn and thorns, hearts and blood, all wove together in compositions that honored indigenous roots while unflinchingly examining historical wounds. Yet even as her artistic voice grew stronger, her body continued its cruel rebellion. Surgeries became routine, pain, a constant companion. But somehow, incredibly, she painted through it all. Propped up in bed when standing became impossible, fingers gripping brushes even when her torso was locked in corrective corsets. The 1940s brought even greater physical challenges. Her spine crumbled slowly, her leg fought constant infection. More than 30 surgical procedures over her lifetime, sometimes in brutal succession. Months passed with her immobilized, stretched by traction devices that pulled her bones apart in hopes of relief. Her paintings from this period carry a different weight. The darkness deepened, but so did the defiance. In one devastating self-portrait, she showed herself split open, nails piercing her flesh, like a martyred saint. A broken classical column, replacing her damaged spine. Yet her expression remained steady, unflinching in the face of agony. Pain had become more than subject matter. It was her most intimate relationship. Each canvas served as both release valve, an act of rebellion against the forces trying to break her spirit. The clarity that suffering brought sharpened every brushstroke, stripped away any pretense or hiding. Politics became another outlet for her fierce energy. The Communist Party claimed her as a member, and she threw herself into causes with the same intensity she brought to painting. Demonstrations, fiery letters, passionate speeches against imperialism and injustice all became part of her artistic practice. When her legs could no longer carry her to protests, she arrived in a wheelchair, signs held high, voice raised in defiant slogans. Physical limitation never translated to spiritual surrender in her world. The recognition that had been slow to come finally arrived in 1953, with Mexico preparing her first solo exhibition, but her health had deteriorated to the point where doctors forbade her attendance. Her response was pure poetry, pure rebellion. The ambulance delivered her to the gallery on a stretcher, which was placed directly in the center of the space. There she lay, dressed in traditional finery, surrounded by her life's work, greeting visitors with tequila and laughter. The fire in her eyes burned as bright as ever, transforming what could have been tragedy into triumph. Her final paintings carried both childlike wonder and devastating honesty. One showed her cradled by revolutionary ideals, casting off symbols of oppression while wearing the steel corset that had become part of her daily uniform. Her very last known work was simpler, sliced watermelons painted with tender attention. One piece bearing words that summed up her entire philosophy: long live life. Even facing death, the defiance remained, mixed with joy and political passion. These weren't just self-portraits she was creating in those final years. They were manifestos written in paint and blood. Frida passed away on a warm July evening in 1954. Just after turning 47 years old, she left this world in the very same blue house where she had taken her first breath, decades earlier, in Coyoacán. The doctors wrote down pulmonary embolism on the official papers, but the people who knew her best, they suspected something more complicated was at play. Her body had been fighting battles for so many years, surgery after surgery, pain layered upon pain like old paint on canvas. She was tired, deeply tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. But even in her final days, even bound to a wheelchair, she refused to stay quiet about the things that mattered to her. Just before the end, she had insisted on attending a demonstration, protesting against what was happening in Guatemala, her fist raised high despite everything. The revolution that burned inside her, it kept flickering right until her very last heartbeat. In her diary, those final words she wrote, they were simple, but they cut deep. She wrote about hoping her exit would be joyful, and about never wanting to return. There was something both heartbreaking and liberating in those words, like she was finally ready to put down the weight she had been carrying. When the time came to say goodbye, they held her funeral at Mexico's most important cultural palace. Her body lay wrapped in the red flag of the Communist Party, surrounded by artists and revolutionaries, friends and family members who had watched her transform pain into something beautiful. Diego Rivera, the man who had loved her and betrayed her in equal measure, he wept openly. He called her the greatest love of his entire life, words that carried the weight of all their complicated years together. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Death, it seemed, couldn't contain Frida Kahlo. In the years right after she passed, only small circles of artists whispered her name. Her paintings, they were hard to fit into neat categories, too political for some tastes, too surreal for others. The art world wasn't quite sure what to do with work that refused to behave according to the rules. Something shifted though, slowly at first, then faster. Through the 70s and 80s, as people began digging up voices that had been buried or forgotten, Frida started getting louder and louder. Scholars and activists, particularly women who were fighting their own battles for recognition, they found something powerful in her story. She wasn't just another painter anymore. She had become something bigger, a symbol that meant different things to different people. For some, she represented the way suffering could be transformed into beauty. For others, she embodied resistance, the refusal to apologize for being exactly who you are. Her face, with that distinctive U-brow and those flowers woven through her dark hair, it started appearing everywhere. That steady gaze of hers, it seemed to look right through whoever was looking back. Her paintings, once tucked away in small collections, began making their way into the world's most famous museums. The blue house where she was born and died, it opened its doors as a museum, letting strangers walk through the rooms where she had lived and loved and created. People started reading her diary like it held secrets about how to live authentically, in a world that often punishes authenticity. Her words, her images, they spoke to people dealing with their own pain, their own struggles with identity, their own fights against systems that wanted to keep them small. What's remarkable is how someone who spent much of her living years in the shadow of her famous husband managed to step so fully into the light after death. It's as if she had been waiting, patiently, for the world to be ready for everything she had to say. The mirror she left behind, it's still there, reflecting back at anyone brave enough to look, not asking for pity, not inspiring fear, but demanding something much more difficult: fire. The kind of fire that burns away everything fake and leaves only what's real. There's something almost magical about how a person can become more than just themselves, how they can transform into something that speaks to hearts across continents and generations. When we think about true artistic power, it's rarely about perfection. It's about truth, raw and unfiltered. Picture a world where being different wasn't something to hide, where pain could become beauty, where the very things that made you an outsider could become your greatest strength. This is the world one remarkable woman created through her art. A world where contradictions weren't flaws but fascinating complexities worth celebrating. Her face has become one of the most recognizable in human history, appearing everywhere from street corners to museum walls, from tiny souvenirs to massive murals. That distinctive unibrow, those flowers crowning dark hair, that penetrating gaze that seems to look right through you, these features have become symbols that transcend their original owner. But recognition isn't the same as understanding, and what makes her story truly powerful goes far deeper than fame. She lived in a time when the world expected certain things from women, from artists, from people who didn't fit neatly into society's carefully drawn boxes. Instead of conforming, she chose something much braver. She chose to be completely unapologetically herself. Her body carried pain that most of us can barely imagine, yet she transformed that suffering into art that speaks to anyone who has ever felt broken. The way she painted herself, surrounded by thorns, split open like a cracked column, bleeding but never defeated. These images capture something universal about the human experience of enduring and surviving. She loved boldly and without shame in an era that demanded silence about such things. Her relationships, her desires, her politics, her heritage, everything about her was lived out loud when the world preferred whispers. She wore her bisexuality like those golden jewels she adorned herself with, openly and with pride. The contradictions in her life tell their own story. A communist who loved luxury, a woman repeatedly betrayed who kept opening her heart, a person whose body was failing, but whose spirit remained unbreakable. These weren't inconsistencies. They were the complex layers that make humans interesting, the messy realities she refused to smooth over or hide. Her paintings were once considered too personal, too strange, too much for polite society. Critics didn't know what to make of work that was so intensely autobiographical, so unflinchingly honest about pain and passion and the female experience. Art was supposed to be more distant, more universal, more masculine than what she was creating. Now those same paintings hang in the world's greatest museums, drawing crowds who stand mesmerized before canvases that seem to pulse with life and emotion. Her self-portraits don't just show us how she looked, they show us how it felt to be her, to live in her skin, to see the world through her extraordinary eyes. She became a symbol without ever trying to be one, simply by refusing to lie about her experience. For communities that had never seen themselves reflected in high art, her work was revolutionary, proof that their stories mattered, that their pain and joy and complexity deserved to be witnessed and honored. Women found in her example a different way of being powerful, one that didn't require permission or approval from anyone else. Disabled artists saw that physical limitations didn't have to mean creative limitations, that sometimes the very things that cause us pain can become the source of our greatest strength. Her homeland claimed her as a cultural treasure, recognizing in her work the essence of Mexican identity, the folklore and traditions and revolutionary spirit that defined a nation. She painted Mexico not as others saw it, but as she felt it, from the inside, with the intimacy of someone whose roots ran deep into that ancient soil. The margins of society, where she spent much of her life, became in her hands the center of attention. She showed that the most interesting stories often come from the edges, from people who don't fit the standard narrative, whose very existence challenges assumptions about what's normal or acceptable. Her legacy lives on, not just in museums, but in the courage of everyone who chooses authenticity over approval, who turns their differences into their strengths, who refuses to be anything less than completely themselves. She never asked to become immortal. She simply painted her truth with such fierce honesty that it became everyone's truth.